Hey, it's lunchtime. Welcome to What's for Lunch conversations about trends and trade in food and ag and how they affect what's on your plate. This series is designed to examine current issues from a variety of perspectives, sometimes controversial and sometimes not, but always with a unique perspective, always interesting and always lively. I'm Susan Burns, your lunchtime host, and I am thrilled to be here with a power-packed host, or power-packed panel. And today we're talking about GMOs, health, human rights, and trade. The speakers with us today, we have a stellar panel: Carey Gillam, Michael Baum, and Uche Ewelukwa. I will introduce you to them and their backgrounds in just a second. Today we're talking about GMOs, as I said, in a little bit different perspective than last time. Last time we discussed them in the context of NAFTA and what the implications of the renegotiated USMCA are. Today we're talking about the tug of war on safety of GMOs and the chemicals used in their production, with industry claiming that they're safe and a lot of other people saying that they're not. So what do we know? What does industry know? And what did we learn in the recent case against Monsanto by DeWayne Johnson? And what is it that the jury found so compelling about that testimony that they awarded $250 million in punitive damages? We also want to talk about, in light of this evidence, what is the corporate social responsibility obligation? In other words, do the Monsantos of the world have an obligation, a social responsibility? Do we have enough evidence that it places a responsibility on governments to take action to protect citizens? And what are the international human rights implications here? I mean, are there any obligations in trade or treaty negotiations or others? And we only have an hour and 15 minutes today, so we're not going to be able to talk about all these issues in depth, but we are super delighted to have this stellar panel. I'm going to introduce first Carey Gillam, who is a veteran investigative journalist, more than 25 years covering corporate news, including 17 years as a senior correspondent for Reuters. She is the author of a recently published book called Whitewash: The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer, and Corruption of Science, which is an expose of corporate corruption in agriculture. And this book won a literary award, or several literary awards, but recently the Rachel Carlson Book Award from Society of Environmental Journalists. And Carey works now as a research director for the nonprofit U.S. Right to Know. Then also we have with us Michael Baum. He is a senior managing partner of Baum Hedlund, Ariste and Goldman. I might have butchered that, but his firm represents DeWayne Johnson, the plaintiff in the case that I mentioned. And the total damages were $289 million, but let's see. Hang on a second here. Okay, some audio was coming through from somebody else. But so the total damages were $289 million, and that included the $250 million in punitive damages that were mentioned earlier. But there are multiple similar other cases being litigated, and Mr. Johnson's case was regarded, at least by the plaintiff's team, as a bellwether case, with all sides watching and working on this and trying to manage what happens and what the outcomes are or were. And Uche Ewelukwa teaches international and intellectual property law at the University of Arkansas, and I was privileged to take a few classes from Uche last year. I obtained my LLM in food and ag law from the University of Arkansas. She's an active member of the American Bar Association's section of international law and serves as co-chair on a variety of committees and vice chair as well. She is the Secretary General of the African Society of International Law, and she is widely published with scholarship focusing on international investment law and arbitration, business and human rights, among other things. One of the courses I took from Uche was a course on corporate social responsibility, and it was very interesting. So we can expect a lot of great comments from her as well as everybody on the panel. So to start us off today, we're going to start with Carey Gillam, who is going to explain her her findings here. Just switching the screen up. So hang on a second. Carey, are you with us?
I am. Good afternoon.
Welcome. Good afternoon to you. So let's start. I want to hear about your book, which I've read, but it always is a great opportunity to hear about what's behind it and what went into it.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the webinar. I appreciate that. So the book Whitewash, this is really the culmination of 20 years of research and reporting that I've done, most of that with Reuters. I started work at Reuters in 1998, and that's when Monsanto had just introduced genetically engineered crops, and they were really, changing and reforming agricultural practices, and several of their rivals jumped in to the game as well. It changed the way farmers were growing our food in many respects, and it significantly altered the landscape in terms of pesticide use in agriculture. So how the book came about was in 2015, my publisher, who was not my publisher at the time, of course, came to me and said, "This stuff looks really interesting. Could you write a book?" And I initially said, no one's going to want to read a book about pesticides necessarily. But they convinced me that people would. And so I did write the book. And, the timing of everything that's going on with the litigation and the regulatory issues and concerns around the world, it really all is coming together. And I'm glad that people are paying attention. So the book, in many respects, is about Monsanto and this chemical called glyphosate. Many people now know the name glyphosate. I'm not sure it was a household name just a year or so ago. But people don't seem to understand still, I don't think in the general mainstream, that this chemical glyphosate and talking about glyphosate use in agriculture and in residential use and otherwise, it's not a sexy topic, but it's a topic that touches all of our lives in many different ways. And your listeners today, and probably all of us, had a little bit of this weed killer. Glyphosate is an herbicide, it's a weed killer. We probably had this in your breakfast or your lunch today. This is a chemical that scientific research shows is tied to cancer, kidney, liver problems, reproductive health concerns, and other health issues. You probably fed a little bit to your kids before they went off to school today. You wouldn't know this in large part because our federal government and Monsanto and others in the chemical industry have worked really hard to make sure you don't know these things and the revelations that are in Whitewash. So if we could go to the next slide. So as I said, the book, much like Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, this book focuses on glyphosate. Rachel Carson talked about DDT. This one talks about Monsanto and glyphosate, sort of as the poster child for a bigger problem. Glyphosate herbicides have been on the market for about 45 years now. For decades, they've been used by homeowners on their lawns and gardens, groundkeepers, parks, school districts, golf courses. They're used for weed management, and notably by farmers on their crops, in the fields that grow the food that we eat. What's really important about this pesticide is that the use of this has just become phenomenal. In the 1990s, we were using about 124 million pounds each year annually, each year worldwide. That now is close to 2 billion pounds a year of this pesticide.
Wow.
And and the surge is directly tied to the introduction of these genetically engineered crops. Now, the companies like to say, this is to feed the world and they're more environmentally friendly and sustainability and all of these sorts of things. But the very first crop was a crop designed to be sprayed with and to encourage the use of glyphosate-based herbicides. And sitting here today, some 20 years after the introduction of these crops, the main genetic trait planted and harvested around the world again still is herbicide tolerance. It's not about feeding the world, it's about selling herbicides. So, this has been billions of dollars in revenues for Monsanto and other companies that now sell these herbicides. So it's a very big deal for the chemical industry. It's also, as I said, a very big deal for us because research has shown that this chemical, as use has increased, it's become pervasive in our food supply, in our environment, it's in our water, our soil, it's found in our own bodies, in urine tests and blood tests. And it's important, of course, because it's been tied to health problems. I mean, researchers for our own government have even found it in rainfall. This is how pervasive this is. And it's such an interesting story because the rise of this chemical has not been a straightforward story. What I also lay out in Whitewash is that the records show us data that I've obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and through legal documents. This is a story of manipulated science, secretive arrangements with academics and others, regulators who've looked the other way, just a lot of deception, decades of deception is really how I view it. And importantly, this is only one chemical in one company, and the story is repeated many times over with other companies and other pesticides. So I've got to talk faster, I guess. Let's move on. I don't want to hog the day here, but I do want to show Monsanto and others in the chemical industry have really tried to downplay the harmful evidence of this chemical. And I just wanted to share here a few expert voices because there are scientists around the world, many dozens, hundreds, who are concerned about this, and these are leading scientists. So these are just a few voices of people who've looked at the science and expressed concerns. We could move on to the next slide. So what has happened over the years is use of this chemical glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides, as that has accelerated, the scientific scrutiny has also accelerated. And there's such a body of evidence of this chemical, and it is so widely used that in 2015 it was examined, the scientific record was examined by our International Agency for Research on Cancer. And this group is part of the World Health Organization. And that's what they do, is they look at substances to see if they have a carcinogenic potential, if they could be considered a hazard in terms of carcinogenicity. And they looked at glyphosate, and they did indeed find that if you look at all of the different evidence, that they determined it was a probable human carcinogen. They looked at studies done in experimental animals. They looked at epidemiology, which is study of human people, human experience, exposures, and disease incidents. And they looked at mechanistic data, DNA damage in people who had real-world exposures. And when they put all of that together, they determined again that it was a probable human carcinogen. They only found limited evidence in epidemiology. They determined that the animal studies gave sufficient evidence, and they found that the mechanistic was strong, very strong evidence. So if we could move on.
Carey, just one quick question. When you say the mechanistic, what do you mean by that?
So like one really good study, or one that they looked at, was people in Colombia who had been exposed to aerial spray, and they of glyphosate-based herbicides, and they looked at they took samples and were able to see DNA disruption in their serums, or their blood, or their DNA. I don't know how you do that. I'd have to go back and look at it, but they were able to see DNA breaks and damage. Okay. They compared that to groups who were not, who were similarly situated but not aerially sprayed, and they didn't see that level of damage. Okay. And there are different kinds of studies in vivo and in vitro as well that they look at. But so what happened after this International Agency for Research on Cancer, if you want to go to the next slide, this is where Michael's expertise certainly will come in, is all of this litigation. that we see sort of exploded around the United States. And there's now roughly 9,500 or so people suing Monsanto. They're accusing the company of knowing that its glyphosate-based herbicides, Roundup and other brands, could cause cancer. And importantly, they're accusing Monsanto of suppressing that evidence, of covering up and failing to warn people of the dangers. And Michael's firm has been very instrumental in uncovering a lot of these, what we call the Monsanto papers, these internal documents that Monsanto's had to turn over in discovery. So I'm hoping he'll talk a lot more about that. We could move on to the next slide. I wanted to share this because one of the things that Monsanto has done repeatedly throughout the years that we see, and other chemical industries do this, companies do this, in pharmaceutical industry and energy, and I mean, it's tobacco, it's part of a corporate playbook, but Monsanto's been really aggressive in its efforts to manipulate and deceive. And I just think this example, with what they tried to do to discredit this International Cancer Agency, is a really good one. After the International Agency came out and said it looks like a probable human carcinogen based on the scientific evidence, Monsanto set about immediately to discredit these scientists, and they acted very shocked and very outraged that how could they come up with this, probable human carcinogen? This is just crazy. This is the safest, chemical ever. Well, you see in the internal documents that Monsanto predicted this, that they were very worried when they learned that IARC was going to look at it. They talked internally about having vulnerability in epidemiology, exposure, genotoxicity. They knew what the science said, and they knew there was a reason to be concerned for it to be scrutinized by this international agency. If you move on to the next slide, you see that they even predicted, if you can go to the next slide, they even predicted pretty closely. They either thought they'd get a 2B or a 2A rating. They got the 2A. Monsanto knew what was coming. They were not shocked in any respect. If you go to the next slide, you see that they also went ahead, again, before IARC, this is before IARC even met, they orchestrated a plan, or they drew up a plan that they called Orchestrate Outcry with the IARC decision. This is a very long document, but they lay out a whole very detailed strategy to discredit this agency and to create, outcry and doubt, essentially, about the validity of this classification. And this is illustrative of what we've seen the company do for years. Anytime any sort of scientific research or report or paper comes out showing some concern or calling for more investigation about harmful impacts associated with this chemical, the company immediately jumps to discredit them and try to invalidate the finding. If you go to the next slide, other things I talk about in the book that you see through the Freedom of Information documents and through the discovery documents, other elements of deception, ghost-written research papers. Michael, I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Alternative assessments. There have been plenty of studies that Monsanto is aware of. One of Monsanto's own studies that they submitted to the EPA that showed rare tumors in mice that caused real concern with the EPA. But what happens is Monsanto will counter with an alternative assessment and convince regulators to discount their own experts and decide with Monsanto's assessments. You also see they have networks of European and US scientists to push their safety messages, but they want these scientists to appear to be independent. They don't want anybody knowing they're collaborating and working with Monsanto on messaging, but the documents show us that they are. And in many situations, sometimes money is changing hands. There are front groups that have been set up to discredit scientists or journalists, including me in my book. You see in one really interesting memo, you see them providing the EPA, Monsanto providing the EPA with what they call talking points for the EPA to use when questioned about glyphosate. And you see them very specifically working really hard to try to kill a review of glyphosate toxicity by this other agency. We call it the US UTSDR, which is affiliated with Health and Human Services and CDC. They successfully were able to kill that off, working with top EPA officials. So the evidence of Monsanto's efforts to suppress information is very, very strong over the years. If you could move on to the next slide. And this is just a quote from the judge in the Johnson case. The initial judge, Carnell, he was not the one that tried the case, but you can see that early on, he even says, if you look at the internal correspondence, it certainly looks like they sought to influence the scientific literature to prevent internal concerns from reaching public sphere. Yeah, then we can move on. So the next slide is again about manipulation of science. This is another internal memo where they talk about ghostwriting and refer to, this is how we did it with with the William Croson Monroe study in 2000. The William Croson Monroe study in 2000 is something that regulators around the world have relied on in terms of safety assessment of glyphosate. And we see here Monsanto scientists talking about having ghostwritten that paper. And there's many more. If you want to go on, there's many more. This is something, critical reviews in toxicology. This is a really egregious example of what they've done. This was an independent review, said it was an independent review, titled an independent review. The disclosure language said neither any Monsanto employee or any attorney reviewed any of the manuscript. When it turns out the internal documents show that they were very heavily involved and were paying a couple of the authors directly and were editing heavily and drafting and rewriting and all sorts of things. So they've actually just recently had to the journal issued a statement of concern about the integrity and accuracy of this declaration. We can move on. Front groups. These are some of the front groups that the documents show us that Monsanto and chemical industry players work with. These groups look like, again, that they're independent, coming up with their own scientific messaging, when in fact we find that they're often receiving money, direction, and collaborating with Monsanto and others in the chemical industry. Do you want to go to the next one? I feel like we probably don't need to go through all of these. This is academics review. You can see here in the language, when they set this up, this front group, they wanted to make sure that Monsanto was in the background so as not to harm the credibility of the information. But this group has done very well and issued a lot of policy papers and statements and articles, all very favorable to Monsanto and GMOs and glyphosate and the chemical industry agenda, without disclosing all of the connections and the financing that's behind the scenes. The next slide is another example. This group, American Council on Science and Health, which sounds, very, very good. Sounds like something that we would want to depend on and look to for authentic information about science and health. And you can see here they're basically selling themselves to Monsanto. They need a little bit of money, and you can't see here down in this. This is just a screenshot, of course, but this email string goes on, and essentially, they're trading money for positive messaging. So the next slide shows you, so all the deceptive spin and the propaganda and the front groups and, the suppression and manipulation of science, all of that has helped this explosion of glyphosate use. And this map just illustrates a little bit of what I talked about earlier. And this is in the United States, of course, not globally, but you can see that glyphosate use has expanded very dramatically since genetically engineered crops were introduced. The brown illustrates the glyphosate use.
Imagine that, and we still have world hunger.
And again, this is not, this is not a map, but this is from the U.S. Geological Survey. This is not, some sort of advocacy group. This is government data. You can move on to the next slide. This comes from a Monsanto internal report. This is again in the 90s, when Monsanto was looking to introduce genetically engineered crops, they wanted to do it because their patent was expiring on glyphosate, and they were looking for a way to keep market share and keep demand for their particular products, Roundup and others, and that's why they introduced Roundup or ready crops. And you can see they were able to do very well with that, with maintaining their hold on that market. Right, now you can move on, that's fine. And so what happened with that, of course, is we have glyphosate used in producing dozens of common foods. You can see it's not just soy and corn like many people think. Glyphosate is used in vineyards. It's used to grow, in orange groves. It's used in vegetables and a whole array of different farming applications. If you move on, you can see this is what has happened environmentally because of this explosion of glyphosate use. We've had weed resistance. Over 100 million acres now of weeds that have become resistant to glyphosate-based herbicides because, again, we've used spraying this directly over crops. And as weed resistance has grown, farmers have used more glyphosate to try to counter weeds. And it's just become this vicious cycle that has contributed to degradation of soil health, water contamination, all of these other environmental problems, loss of different biodiversity, pollinators, etc. I get into the book and a lot of that into the book. If you move on, this chart will show you just how glyphosate-resistant weeds worldwide, how they've spiked because of this overuse of glyphosate. And it's notable that Monsanto told the EPA that this wouldn't happen back when it introduced genetically engineered crops, because weed scientists were saying, you can't do this. You can't use this weed killer in this way and not have a lot of environmental problems. And Monsanto, convinced the EPA the scientists were wrong and it was right, and this is what's happened. If you move on. Again, this is an example you can see now. This is showing up in finished food products. Consumer testing shows glyphosate weed killer in a whole array of foods that you probably feed your kids or snack on. Served at, pick them up at school lunch programs, a lot of breakfast bars and things. If you move on, this is a story I did. FDA, an FDA chemist did some testing on honey, pulled honey samples from grocery store shelves around the country and looked at even organic honey and was finding what would be considered illegally high levels of glyphosate here in our honey samples. The next slide, the same chemist did some testing of oatmeal products that he pulled from store shelves, found the same thing, worrisome levels of glyphosate weed killer in oatmeal. A lot of it were baby oatmeal products. It's notable that after he reported his findings, he was pulled by the FDA from any further pesticide residue testing. Not allowed to do any more of that, still to this day.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I get a lot of interesting stuff from my FDA FOIA documents. If you go to the next slide, this is just another FDA memo. A different chemist talks about finding glyphosate in granola and crackers. And if you jump to the next slide, you'll actually see part of his little memo where he says, I brought wheat crackers, granola cereal, and corn meal from home. There's a fair amount in all of them. He basically talks about broccoli was the only thing he couldn't find glyphosate in.
Wow.
I feel like I'm overdoing my time, but if you'll go just a few more. This is just a study showing we're finding glyphosate in soy-based infant formula as well, which makes sense. It's used in soybeans.
Yeah, I mean, that's disturbing, I think, for people that think it's safe and then don't really feeding it to kids.
Yeah. Again, this is University of California, San Diego School of Medicine data, tracking glyphosate levels in people and finding both the levels and the incidence rising over the years. Because again, this is in our food and it's in our water, it's in our air. So I guess it makes sense that it's in our bodies. Next slide. This is again a nod to what I said earlier. This is glyphosate is worrisome, but it's not the only thing that we've got going on out there. And if you make glyphosate go away, we haven't solved the problems of pesticide residues in foods. This is USDA data. About 85% of foods that they tested had pesticide residues, weed killers, insecticides, fungicides, things like that. They're even still finding DDT in foods. Move on, chlorpyrifos or chlorpyrifos, however you want to say it. This is a Dow Chemical insecticide. This is known to be neurodevelopmentally damaging to children. It's known to be so dangerous that the Obama administration was slated to pull it from the market in 2017. Dow Chemical and the Trump administration got together, and Dow convinced the Trump administration to reverse that planned ban. And it is still on the market, even though we know that it is harmful to our children. A federal judge has ordered the EPA to move to ban it. The EPA has not done that and is looking to appeal that. So that is all still going on, and we are still feeding our children this insecticide. This is, again, this stuff is not, sort of secret, or these concerns are not held just by a few. These are pediatricians concerned about childhood pesticide exposure, part of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Very worried about what pesticide residue exposure is doing to our children and their brain function and behavioral issues. If you move on, this is from our top scientist in our National Institutes of Health, Linda Birnbaum. She is our top toxicologist in the US. She runs the National Toxicology Program. She put out this paper last year saying, our regulations have not kept pace with scientific advances. These chemicals are causing serious health problems, and these are at levels that previously were assumed to be safe. Our children face the highest risk. This is really important to our future. We need to pay attention to this. Next slide is just one more. This is a newer study that's come out showing exposures to glyphosate-based herbicides at doses considered safe are actually, modifying the gut microbiota, causing potential early developmental problems. There's a host of evidence that we need to pay attention to this. If you want to jump to the next slide, this is one more. I'm beating you over the head with it. High consumption of high pesticide residues associated with lower probabilities of pregnancy. These are reproductive problems. These are from scientists at Harvard and other places. This is not wacky, folks out on the sidelines here. Last slide, or second to the last slide, this is something that came out from French scientists. The study has a lot of flaws, a lot of issues, but again, it's just showing that it looks like there is definitely something going on with pesticide residue impacts on human health. Next slide, maybe we can skip over her. Rachel Carson, she's my idol. She warned us about unchecked use of pesticides and what it could do to us. We paid attention for a little bit, and we're not paying attention now.
We don't want to skip over Rachel.
I know. All right. Go to the next one thing. And then I just have to say this. This is a book, Whitewash. It's a book Monsanto really didn't want you to read. This was in the Johnson case. They filed a motion asking to exclude whitewash from evidence, which I thought was a very nice compliment. So that is all I have, and I will shut up now. Thank you.
Well, definitely no need to shut up, Carey. That was a very interesting presentation, to say the least. And now we're going to hear from a nice segue here. We'll hear from Michael Baum, and I'm going to just hand the controls over to Michael, and hang on as I do this shift here. And then how about if I unmute your mic? Michael, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, welcome. And we'd love to hear from you now with all that nice background from Carey on the lay of the land and the science that's been found. I'd love to hear how you worked with that in the Roundup litigation against Monsanto.
Well, thank you, Susan, for inviting me and Carey as well. I don't know Uche very well, but it is, a privilege to be discussing this disclosure of information that Carey and my firm and other firms have been working on to essentially help people know what the risks are from this, for the most part, sort of background piece of chemistry that's been infiltrating our lives, and we need to know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I'll try to shorten mine up because Carey did such a nice job, but I want to backtrack through a few things.
We have time, Michael, so don't worry about that.
So let's see. Susan, can you release the control or maybe go to the next slide? Okay. So
you should be able to control it, Michael. You should be able to.
Yeah, I think it's moving now.
Okay, good.
So in 2014, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, announced that it was going to be looking into and investigating a cancer signal for glyphosate that had been shown up in some existing publications that indicated there was DNA damage occurring to people exposed to, or animals exposed to glyphosate. And that set off alarms within Monsanto, and the fact that IARC was going to be investigating it set them off on a plan that was consistent with what they'd been doing in the past, which was trying to control the message. They decided to publish favorable data as soon as possible that IARC could rely on, organize outcry against IARC in order to invalidate the messenger, insulate. They wanted to insulate regulators and their employees from the IARC expected negative outcome and assert that it was an outlier based on incomplete data. What I have here is what ended up being published in March of 2015, which is, well, announced and then later published in 2015, were IARC's findings that glyphosate is probable a human carcinogen. And they relied on published human, animal, and cell tissue studies. We refer to those in the trial as the 3 pillars of causation science. The animal and cell studies showed the highest level of correlation, strong or sufficient correlation between glyphosate and cancer. And the human studies, the epidemiology, showed a technical term, limited connection between glyphosate or Roundup exposure to cancer. That term limited doesn't mean not very much or very little, which is the way Monsanto and chemical industry apologists have been sort of characterizing the IARC outcome. Limited means, if you look at the bottom of this slide, a positive association has been observed between exposure to the agent and cancer, for which a causal interpretation is considered by the working group to be credible, but chance, bias, or confounding could not be ruled out with reasonable confidence. So they were saying it wasn't a little bit of evidence or just very little, which is the way Monsanto has framed the IARC outcome. It is that there was a credible association, and that there might have been some bias or confounding that could not be ruled out, but the animal data and the cell tissue data, that's the mechanistic data that tends to show what the mechanism is for causing the cancer, which is oxidative stress and things like that, or causing DNA damage. It's the strong evidence in the cell tissue studies and the animal studies combined with the epidemiology showed a probable carcinogenicity. So, next slide. So for some reason, Susan, it's not moving. There we go. This is a plot of the epidemiology that we used in the trial. This shows at the blue line, the blue vertical line shows where there's no risk, and the black dots to the right show where there's a positive risk. Some of those are statistically significant, some of them aren't, which means that some of them it's not likely caused by chance. Some of them, they can't rule out that it was chance. But the group of these as a whole, all of them being to the right, showing that there's a positive risk ratio across multiple trials in multiple places and by multiple researchers, is extremely unlikely. And so it showed that there is a probable carcinogenicity, notwithstanding that some of them are not statistically significant. If you look at the bottom, there's a study. Go back to that epidemiology slide.
Sorry.
There's a study called the Andreotti study that came out just before the trial started. And that was part of a longer-term study that the DeRouche 2005 was a part of. And it found that there was not much risk. And Monsanto has chosen to focus in on that study and disregard, for the most part, all these other studies showing a positive relationship. And that's been a lot of the debate scientifically in the litigation. The problem with that particular study is that a lot of the members of that study at the very beginning became part of the study before the GMO products hit the market. And so many of the ones who in 94 were not glyphosate exposed or Roundup exposed individuals became exposed through the explosion of Roundup use within a few years later. So they were misclassified as not being exposed, and there were misclassification of individuals so that people who were exposed or not exposed weren't actually at the correct group, assigned to the correct group. And over time, 36% of the people didn't continue to stay in the study, and instead of not counting them or reevaluating the study, they extrapolated data from those people that were missing. And that extrapolation plus the misclassification made the risk disappear. And so that study is not, although it's another piece of information, it's not as reliable as Monsanto cracked it up to be. And they try to say, only look at that study and don't pay attention to these other positive studies, even the statistically significant ones. And one of the things they really don't want you to pay attention to is this next slide, dose-related epidemiology. In a couple of these studies, they found statistically significant elevated non-Hodgkin's lymphoma amongst people who used it more often than people who didn't. So there's people that used it in this McDuffie study 0 to 2 days a year, and there wasn't much risk there. You see, it's right on that blue line. That shows that there was not an elevated risk. But for people who used it greater than 2 days per year, there was a doubling of the risk. And so low use, you'd expect, well, maybe you're not going to have enough use to create a cancer, or create damage. But elevated use shows statistically significant damage. Same with the Erickson study in 2008. Less than 10 days, it shows elevated risk, but not statistically significant risk. But at greater than 10 days use, that's 2.36. That's a doubling of the risk, and it was statistically significant, not likely to be the result of chance. This set of data right here, based on our interviews with the jurors afterwards, was one of the principal things that convinced the jurors that there was a causal association between Roundup exposure and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In addition to the epidemiology and that dose response data, there were rat and mouse studies that showed repetition or replication across different studies of similar cancers, and that's also a signal of carcinogenicity. This color chart shows where the same type of cancer or same type of tumor was showing up in different studies and in different strains of rats. So you'll see the two green ones are in two different studies. And if you go to the next slide, in the mice studies, you'll see that there's malignant lymphomas, the same tan color, or the hemangiosarcomas, the same blue color. Those were going across different studies showing similar tumors found in different strains or different studies. Again, replication showing it's a probable connection. One of the most significant ones is that malignant lymphoma showing up in those 4 studies, the Atkinson, Sugimoto, Wood, and Kumar. Malignant lymphoma in mice is the closest associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in humans. And so that was a pretty strong signal itself. Next slide. This is the mechanistic studies. These are cell studies, cell tissue studies, showing if you see the vertical line, the majority of them are over to the right. And the fact that so many of the studies are over to the right, showing elevated risk and elevated appearance of DNA damage, is a strong indication of a link between Roundup or glyphosate and non-Hodgkin lymphoma or DNA damage leading to tumors. All 3 of these pillars of causation were relied upon by our scientists, and we used them throughout the trial. So we actually got involved with this project in late 2015 after the publication of IARC's monograph. And one of our staff had an uncle who worked on an orchard, and he got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he was using Roundup, and his family had done some research and found that there was a connection and asked us to look into it. We did look into it and found the IARC monograph, which went through these 3 pillars of science, and decided we would start preparing a lawsuit for McCall family. He ended up dying from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma on Christmas 2015. Kind of a sad event. Anyway, we teamed up with some other lawyers, some friends of ours. We found that we're also working on these cases. We ended up filing suit in early 2016 and obtained a lot of internal documents showing Monsanto's internal awareness of their carcinogenicity and DNA damage associated with glyphosate or Roundup exposure. One of the issues has been, well, how could this be that's been on the market for so long and nobody pays attention? Nobody has seen this risk. So one of the reasons why was that they suppressed it or they attacked it. And they had a program that they called Whack-A-Mole, which I'll show you a document about soon. And they had an effort to invalidate what they called free science or independent scientists and keep that data from being publicly known. In addition, the regulators analyzed glyphosate alone, and the additives, the adjuvants, the surfactants that were combined with the glyphosate separately from the glyphosate together. And the formulation penetrates cells and is more toxic than either of the chemicals separately. And so it created this loophole where the regulators would test glyphosate alone and it wouldn't show as much toxicity as the formulation that is actually sprayed on the food that we eat. And as a result, you would have a lot of regulators saying, oh, we don't see much risk, because they're not studying the formulation. So in working on this case, we got a lot of documents. They're not that Carey referred to as the Monsanto papers. We published those when we got used the protocol for declassifying the documents and circulated them around the world. It's had a big impact on the way the case has been litigated, the way scientists and journalists have been able to, and politicians and legislators have been able to look at what actually has been behind the curtain regarding Monsanto's use and suppression of information regarding Roundup's connection with carcinogenicity. So some of those documents we're going to walk through now. Back in 1999, there were a set of these free studies that had been published showing genotoxicity, some DNA damage associated with exposure to glyphosate or Roundup. And so Monsanto wanted to, maintain their freedom to operate and prevent regulators from stepping in and limiting its Roundup's use because of a genotoxicity problem. So they hired a well-known genotoxologist, James Perry, to go through those studies, analyze them, and decide what Monsanto should do about it, and hopefully come to the conclusion that it's not a problem. However, and this is one of a series of emails regarding Dr. Perry's findings. He actually found and wrote up for Monsanto that there is a genotoxicity problem, and they need to conduct some studies because Roundup as a formulation is causing DNA damage, and that they need to research that because they've been looking at glyphosate alone, not Roundup as a formulation. So the people that hired him to do this analysis, Bill Hayden's, up at the top here, you see it from Bill Hayden's, writes an email in September of 1999. So that's 17 years or 16 years before IARC actually published its results. And to this, he says, as a result of seeing Perry's analysis, says, however, let's step back and look at what we are really trying to achieve here. We want to find or develop someone who is comfortable with the genotox profile of glyphosate Roundup and who can be influential with regulators and scientific outreach operations when genotox issues arise. Now, my read is that Perry is not currently such a person, and it would take quite some time and dollars, studies to get him there. We simply aren't going to do the studies Perry suggests. Right there in one email is a summary of what happened to the science and why it was that so few people knew about the risks of Roundup formulations. They did not publish Dr. Perry's results. They did not do the analyses that he recommended be done. They did not send his results to the EPA like they were obligated to do. Instead, they ghost wrote a study or a review to sit with authors that they paid to present a paper that said the opposite, said there's not a problem. And for 16 years following that, there was a reliance on that analysis, that review, that said that there was no risk. Can we go to the next slide?
Michael, after telling you we're okay on time, I have to give you a 3-minute warning.
Okay.
I hate to do it because this is so interesting.
Okay, so I'll go through the next couple of slides and end off. So here is an internal email between one of their AstroTurf individuals, Bruce Chassie, and Donna Farmer, and they're talking about a publication that indicated there was a problem with exposure to glyphosate and Roundup in foods that kids were eating. And the response here is, funny you should say that. Donna Farmer, glyphosate toxicology, and I have been playing whack-a-mole for years and calling it just that. We were joking about it yesterday. Their view of external science that's independent from industry is it's a game where they play whack-a-mole to suppress that science from being published. We go to the next slide. Oops. So the same Donna Farmer says, and now again, that you cannot say that Roundup does not cause cancer. We have not done carcinogenicity studies with Roundup. They purposely avoided doing the studies that Dr. Perry recommended they do back in 1999, and purposely avoided testing the Roundup formulation with the surfactant and all the chemicals that they're using to help penetrate cells combined with the glyphosate. That suppressed and led to a long term of people being exposed to Roundup without understanding that there was a carcinogenicity connection. And next slide. Prior to the announcement by IARC that there was a carcinogenicity problem, like Carey showed, they had a detailed battle plan of what to do, who to organize, who to send data to, how to invalidate the IARC and make it seem like it's an outlier. They wanted to do what they could to insulate the regulators and legislators and their employees from the announcement that IARC was going to be making, even before IARC put out the announcement. And then afterwards, they implemented it. They went after anybody who said anything in favor of IARC's findings. They went after the scientists who were on the IARC panel. They tried to defund IARC. They organized legislative efforts to say that, well, they didn't pay close enough attention to that Andreotti study that showed there was no risk, and those other studies aren't worth paying attention to. Can we go to the next slide? So they did analyses of what would happen to their sales and what was happening to their sales as a result of the IARC publication. And this is an email between their head of sales in Western US and the distributor of Roundup in California. This is one of the documents we declassified and played through. And instead of being, concerned and looking into the risks, they were concerned about the effects on sales. And they said, this is the distributor saying, we are being overrun by liberals and morons, sort of like a zombie movie. So we just have to start taking them out one at a time, starting with elections next year. This shows a sort of a callous disregard for the risks, and instead that they needed to suppress and deal with the negative information by stomping on it and killing it, as opposed to looking into the risks and taking care of it. They have not changed their protocol at all. They're still doing it. They're still saying the same stuff. Since Bayer took over, they're doubling down on messaging that undercuts the actual risks and tries to boost their sales instead of taking responsibility for the harms that this chemical, this group of chemicals are causing. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to you. There are about 9,000 cases that are in progress now, and this is not just an individual case, the Johnson case. There are trials coming up in February in San Francisco Federal Court, in March in San Francisco State Court, in April in St. Louis. I mean, we're going to be having trials about every month or two for the next year or so throughout the country. And with that, I'd leave it to you.
Thank you, Michael. That's an amazing presentation and disturbing as well. I would love to have more time and hope we have other opportunities to discuss further. Thank you for that. And Uche is going to talk with us now. Uche, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Well, let's hear from you on corporate social responsibility and accountability on the tail of the information we just heard.
Okay. Good afternoon. So I guess the first two speakers have talked about the science of things and the litigation of things, and I thought I would step back a little bit and look at it from the international perspective. So are you the one that will be moving the slides?
You can. You have the ability to move slides if you like. Otherwise, I can. Whichever way you prefer.
Well, I'm not able to move it from my end, so I don't know.
Okay. How about that? I changed the slide, Uche.
Okay. I guess from a global, I just wanted to put things, introduce some ideas and concepts. And then from there, I want to look at a business and human rights approach to all that we've been talking about. I hope to talk on the responsibility of businesses, since a lot of what we're talking about suggests that businesses are not living up to their responsibility. I hope to talk about the duty of states, and then talk about the whole concept of access to remedy. Next slide, please. Next slide. So with the GM and my own background, I teach right to food, and I also teach corporate social responsibility. I thought it's important to remember the issue of hunger in the world. And as of 2014, we had 220 million people food insecure in Africa, some 34 million insecure in Latin America, and a lot of the food insecurity is in Asia with 512 million people. And so the GM debate resonates a lot in developing countries, and in the developing countries, the tension really has become one between food security and health. Okay. Next slide, please. So this slide, I think it suggests that since the whole GM debate started, that more and more farmers are getting involved, whether willingly or unwillingly. More and more acreage of land are being committed to GM production. More and more countries are getting involved in planting and even importing GM crops. The top exporters, the 5 top exporters, the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, and India. And I think it's important because part of the broader issue in GM debate is the issue of international trade and whether countries have a right to place a ban on GM products. And I think that looking at the top exporters, it raises questions about the policies in these countries. And so the focus is not just on United States, but a country like Brazil and Argentina. And I think that across the board, studies suggest that most of the GM crops are produced in emerging markets as compared to developed countries. And as you can see from the slide too, in terms of countries that are importing, a lot of importing countries are in Latin America. Africa is still like a no man's land. A lot of countries in Africa have been really cautious about GM products. A good number of countries in Africa have placed a ban on GM products. And it raises a number of questions because in the last few weeks or months, there's been a lot of talk about pressure on these countries to lift the ban on GM products. And so the question about sovereignty and the right of countries becomes really very, very important, and I'll touch on that later. But from the map, you can see that Africa is one area where it's going to be a new area for struggle for GM, and whether the African countries can continue to withstand the pressure remains to be seen. But if you take this slide together with the previous slide, where I think the previous slide, you have 220 million people in Africa are food insecure. The pressure is real on African countries. So with 220 million people food insecure and the countries in Africa resisting GM, that's a site for a lot of struggle. So just to summarize the pros and cons of GM, just in case, because I think as a law professor, I try to present somewhat balanced approach to these things, and then see what the issues are and where the next struggle will be. Next slide, please. So in terms of the pros for GM, I think that the argument from the companies are that the issue of efficiency in agricultural production, that GM, it enhances efficiency. There's the argument that it helps to produce crops that are resistant to cold, to disease, to pest, to drought, that increases profits for agricultural producers, including small farmers, that it increases yield, which translates to food security for all. There's also the argument that GM products can also enhance food quality because of they're less affected by fungal infection and pesticide, and there's a decreased use of pesticide. So those are the arguments, and they come, and they're really powerful arguments from the companies that produce GM crops. These are also the arguments that are being pushed in many developing countries, particularly countries in Africa that are already dealing with really serious food insecurity. On the con side, the argument is about environmental hazards, and I think we've all talked about that. There's the argument about harm to human health and I think the two previous speakers have already addressed that. There's also the human rights argument, right? That people have a right over what they should have a right over what they eat. They should have a right of information about what they're eating. So there's strong, powerful human rights arguments. There are even economic concerns. Even assuming that GM crops increase profit, do those profits trickle down to the farmers? And considering the plight of the world farmers, the argument is that the GM crops really benefit the big companies and not the small farmers. And then the bigger issue is also the question of state sovereignty and national security. Even if countries, including countries in Africa, even if they switch to GM, the argument is that it can also threaten their national security because they become completely dependent on foreign companies for their survival. And with long-term dependence can also destroy local production of food. So at this point, I just want to introduce the theme of the right to food, food sovereignty, and food security. And then from there, I bring up other issues. So with the GM food, the one concern is the question of production regulation. There's a lot of concern that even if the arguments, the pros and cons are all true, okay. We can move to the next slide. Yeah, that there's the failure to regulate production is a big concern. Beyond the production regulation are concerns about the distribution regulation, that there's very little regulation at the domestic and at the international level about distribution of GM crops. There's also the concern about lack of coordination and coherence, even at the international level, between international trade institutions and international human rights institutions and the health institutions. You don't have that much coordination. The WTO, for example, is not really coordinating the GM issue with the World Health Organization. And at the international law level, the treaties are also quite inconsistent with one another. And then the last issue that is a lot of countries are struggling with is the tension, or should we, GM crops versus agricultural innovation. When we talk about agricultural innovation, what do we mean? And I think the question is important because a lot of people believe that agricultural innovation is very, very important, and that agricultural innovation is the key to the world's food insecurity problems. So when we talk about agricultural innovation, do we mean a GM crop? Do we mean other types of innovation? Do we mean a kind of sanitized GM production? What do we mean? Can we have agricultural innovation without GM? So those are some of the questions that one is struggling with. Next slide, please. So at this point, we'll talk about the right to food and food insecurity. According to the UN, a UN body, it says that the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food. And I think I want to highlight the issue of alone or in community with others, and also the concept of adequate food, because the UN has said that adequacy involves availability, it involves accessibility, it involves even sustainability. And it's not enough that food is available, it must be adequate. And then the question, of course, is who determines the adequacy of food? Is it the consumer? Is it the companies? Is it the government? So those are some of the questions that one can think about. The next definition is the food sovereignty. And it's also a concept that is increasingly thrown out in international circles. And food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. Now that's another powerful definition. And the issue of cultural appropriateness, where does it fit in the GM debate? And I think the issue of food sovereignty comes up when we talk about countries in Africa, when we think about indigenous populations, when we think about so many other ethnic and cultural minorities. And so again, it's a concept that is making its way in international circles. And the question of where it fits in the GM debate is something that I think it's important to think about. Do people have a right to culturally appropriate food? Or do they even have a right to food? Do we even believe that people have a right to food? So, and then the last concept is the concept of food security. According to the World Food Summit, it says that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now, this is a definition that the World Food Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization have embraced. So it talks about sufficient food, but it also talks about safe and nutritious food. Now, again, where does the concept of food security fit in the GM debate? And I think I can see both sides seizing this definition. The GM companies can say, GM crops help to get you safe and nutritious food. It helps to, the GM companies, also their goal is to get sufficient food. And this is where science comes in, right? What is the science saying about GM products? How the reports and the data that we have, how do they fit with this concept of state food sovereignty? Now, next, I'm just going to look at some of the key instruments that I use to work my way through some of these issues. And from this next slide, you'll see that when it comes to GM and international law, there's just a lot of instruments that sometimes are inconsistent with one another. So at the top, one has to think about the multilateral trade and investment treaties. Now, most of these treaties are for trade liberalization. Most of these treaties call for freedom of trade, freedom of investment, open borders. So when you focus on the multilateral trade and investment treaties, the primary actors are really the big companies. The investment treaties, sometimes they're known as bilateral investment treaties. Most of them, their primary focus is investor protection and investment protection. So when you look at the standard bilateral investment treaty, they talk a lot about investor rights, but really very little about investor responsibility. And then when you look at trade agreements like the World Trade Organization, the focus again is on trade liberalization. And so the issue of a country banning GM products may actually be found to violate WTO agreements. I've come across some documents suggesting, and I haven't found the primary source suggesting that the U.S. government is threatening to bring trade action against companies or countries that ban GM product. So the idea will be that if a country, say a country in Africa, banned GM product, that could be found to violate WTO agreements. So it's something that one has to have in mind, because a lot of countries have signed on to these multilateral trade and investment treaties. Then the next will be the environmental treaties. I think the key treaty here is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there's also a Cartagena Protocol. Now, the Convention on Biological Diversity recognizes the GM, recognizes biotechnology, does not ban biotechnology and GM product. There's no ban on GM product in the multilateral environmental treaties. It only calls for safe handling. Okay, so it's possible that the environmental treaties need to be upgraded, but presently they do not ban. There's no outright ban. There's also the Convention on Access to Information and Public Participation in Decision-Making and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. Now, that could be a promising convention that one can use to get information. And then you have the international human rights treaties. And the human rights treaties talk about right to life. They talk about freedom of information. They talk about the right of minorities. They talk about rights of indigenous population. It also talks about right to food and right to a healthy environment. And then finally, you have what we call soft international law, soft because they are not binding. But even though they're not binding, they increasingly shape the discussion about GM, about multinational companies, and about the responsibility of businesses. So there are two key soft international law instruments I wanted to discuss today. One is the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. And that Rio Declaration comes up with what we call the precautionary principle. And then the second instrument I would like to talk about is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, please note that when it comes to the GM debate, there's a lot of inconsistency and lack of coherence between the trade and investment treaties, the multilateral investment treaties, the human rights treaties. So one of the big problems in international law is how to reconcile all these treaties. Okay, because right now, a country that is a party to all these treaties can find itself in a difficult situation and having to choose whether to respect the human rights treaties or ignore the investment treaties at a cost, a high cost. Next slide. So when it comes to GM product, one could argue that the science is kind of all over the map, that there's lack of coherence in the sciences. And I think that that's where the Rio Declaration comes up. And this is slide 13. The Rio Declaration offers what we call the precautionary principle. And a lot of activists really use the precautionary principle. Let's look at it. It says, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. It says, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. So the precautionary principle acknowledges that sometimes the science might not all be in, and then that's why it says where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a basis for postponing measures. So the question will be, in the GM debate, do we have full scientific certainty? And I think depending on who you speak to, the answer might be yes or no. But even if there's a lack of full scientific certainty, it does not let countries off the hook. And it should not let companies off the hook either. Okay? So I'm going to now move from the Real Declaration and look at the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, I will just say a quick background that for a long time, the international law did not regulate the activities of businesses. For a long time, international law focused on states. International law regulated the activities of states and for the most part did not regulate the activities of non-state actors. In the last decade, there's been a lot of changes in international law and a push for corporate accountability and corporate responsibility. In 2008, the UN came up with what is called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Okay, and it was adopted in 2011. And the UN Guiding Principle says that there are three approaches to these things. One is that there's a business responsibility to respect human rights. Second, it says that there's a state duty to protect human rights. And last, it says that there should be access to remedy. So I'm just going to focus on the business responsibility. Take a look at the UN Guiding Principles 13. It says the business enterprises should respect human rights. This means that they should avoid infringing on the human rights of others and should address adverse human rights impact with which they are involved. Principle 13, I want to focus on Principle 13. It says the responsibility to respect human rights requires that business enterprises avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impact through their own activities and that they address such impacts when they occur. Second, it says that they need to seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impact that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services by their business relationships, even if they have not contributed to those impacts. Last, I want to look at Principle 17. That is the principle that talks about due diligence. And it says that in order to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their adverse human rights impact, business enterprises should carry out human rights due diligence. So again, when I bring it to the GM debate, is there a sense that the businesses involved are carrying out adequate and appropriate human rights due diligence? It goes on to say that the process should include assessing actual and potential human rights impact, integrating and acting upon the findings, tracking responses, and communicating how impacts are addressed. And again, with the GM debate, the question will be, are the companies assessing actual and potential human rights impact? Are they integrating and acting upon the findings? Are they tracking responses? Next slide. I want to quickly talk about the state duty. What is the state duty? You know, when the science is incomplete, when there are people that are on both sides, what is the duty of the state? The UN Guiding Principle says that the duty of the state is to protect. What does this mean? Now, the Principle 1, I want to start on Principle 1. It says that states must protect against human rights abuses within their territory and or jurisdiction by third parties, including business enterprises. For a long time, states felt that were either unwilling or incapable of protecting. It says that this duty requires taking appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress abuse through effective policies, legislations, regulations, and adjudication. And I think it's on this principle, one, that we see some divide between the developed countries and many developing countries. When it comes to the GM debate, food issue, many developing countries, many countries in Africa are not at this stage yet. They are not taking appropriate steps to prevent or to investigate or to punish or to redress. Part of it is lack of capacity. Part of it is lack of willingness. Part of it is pressure from more powerful entities. Okay? Another important principle is principle 24. And principle 24 talks about access to remedy. And this is what ties into Michael Baum's presentation. Principle 24 talks about access to effective remedy. Okay? And it says that as part of their duty to protect against business-related human rights abuses, states must take appropriate steps to ensure, through judicial, administrative, legislative, or other appropriate means, when abuses occur. So states have a duty to provide remedy through courts and non-state mechanisms. Finally, what about treaties? I just want to quickly talk about treaties because I'm sure my time is about to be up. The next slide. It says that states, can we move to the next slide?
You want the guiding principle 9?
Hello?
The guiding principle 9?
Yes. Essentially, the next slide is saying that in treaties, states must create space. They must address these issues in treaties that they sign, right? The next slide, please. So in treaties, I think it's one thing that's important is transparency in treaty negotiation. A lot of countries, really, there's no transparency. And so people are not sure what treaties are being concluded, right? Look at the guiding principle 9. It states that states should maintain, can we go back to 9?
We are.
This is 10. Can we go back to 9? Yeah, it says that states should maintain adequate policy space to meet their human rights obligation when pursuing business-related policy objectives with other states or business enterprises, for instance, through investment treaties and contracts. Okay, so essentially, in their treaties, states should create space for themselves so that they can regulate issues like GM and other kinds of issues. I just, before I wrap up, I want to talk about the next slide, please, because a lot of countries in Africa, a lot of countries in Latin America are also part of multilateral institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the IFC, the WTO. And can we move the one before, the guiding principle 10? The slide before this one.
Uche, you're having a lag time in your what's appearing on your screen, just so you know. I'm at 10.
Okay, thank you. So it says that states, when acting as members of multilateral institutions that deal with business-related issues, they should seek to ensure that those institutions neither restrain the ability of their member states to meet their duty to protect, nor hinder business enterprises from respecting human rights. And this is another issue that needs to be addressed. What is going on within the big institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank? Do states still, do these institutions restrain the ability of countries to meet their obligations? Is there pressure on countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia to ignore some of the issues that we've discussed today? I mean, I'm just raising the issue because when you look at the newspapers, there's some discussion that there's pressure coming from the IMF, coming from the big multilateral institutions. And that shouldn't be so. I think that even within multilateral institutions, states should have the right to protect their citizens. Now, the next slide, and this is probably, I have two more to talk about and then I wrap up. So what's going on? I want to briefly talk about the Canada, United States, Mexico agreement. Do these treaties address GM? Do these treaties address corporate social responsibility? In the Canada, United States, Mexico agreement, this is the one that just replaced NAFTA. There's a chapter 14 on investment, but it really does not address corporate social responsibility. There's a side agreement on environment, but if you take a look at the side agreement, it really does not seriously address most of the issues that we are talking about today. The side agreement basically, it creates what it calls the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And it says it provides a work program for this commission. And the commission is supposed to work towards this work program. For example, promoting the sustainable management and use of natural resources, conserving and protecting biodiversity. But it really does not address, nor does it provide say anything meaningful about corporate social responsibility. However, I want to talk very briefly about Brazil. In 2014, Brazil came up with a model investment cooperation and facilitation agreement. This is a bilateral investment treaty. And it's one of the few BITs that actually has a section on corporate social responsibility. And I think it's interesting because Brazil is one of the top exporters of GM crop. And so I think that it will be interesting to see how Brazil addresses the whole GM crop issue, because the model investment agreement has a section. For example, Brazil concluded an agreement with Malawi. Article 9 talks about corporate social responsibility. It says that investors and their investments shall strive to achieve the highest possible level of contribution to the sustainable development of the host party and the local community through the adoption of a high degree of socially responsible practices. That is huge. But, you know, as they say, the devil is in the details. So one of my research right now is looking at the whole concept of corporate social responsibility in the Brazilian BIT. How effective are these things? What is it? What does it mean? Because if a country that is a top exporter of GM also has a treaty that talks about corporate social responsibility, how does it play out in practice? And the last thing I want to say on this slide is that because for a long time investment treaties protected investors but not the host community, there's been an ongoing crisis in international investment law. And as a result of this crisis, we're seeing some countries completely exiting from the BITs. In other words, they're canceling their bilateral investment treaties. India, Indonesia, South Africa, those are three countries that in the last 3 years have actually canceled almost all of their bilateral investment treaties. These three countries, they decided that the BITs were not balanced, that they favored businesses as against the local population. So I think it might be interesting as part of the GM debate to look at the countries like India and Indonesia and South Africa. What makes a country decide? India, I think India had like some 50 BITs that it canceled. Indonesia, I think about 60 BITs were completely terminated. South Africa, about 20 BITs. So those countries can provide a room for analysis. Finally, in Europe, and I think Michael Baum will have more to say, the issue of access to information has become very, very important. And in Europe, we're seeing a lot of cases. And most of these cases are based on the access to information. And it's really forcing companies to provide more information. Okay, so on the slide, you see a case like Bayer Crop Science. There are just so many cases. And most of the cases were on information on emissions into the environment. What does it mean? What does the right to information mean? And I think that going forward, we're going to see more cases like this. Okay, but I must say that in many countries in Africa, on the one hand, you have the access to information, right to information litigation, but there's also another type of litigation that one should be really careful about. These are the defamation lawsuits that companies are bringing against NGOs. So in South Africa, in many countries in Asia, companies are actually bringing lawsuits against activists. And some of these lawsuits are based on defamation. And the argument, the fear is that could chill and make it more difficult for NGOs and local population to challenge the activities of companies. So in conclusion, where are we now and what's the way forward? I think that there's a big debate going on. I think that countries in Africa are in a tough position because on the one hand, these are countries that are dealing with serious food insecurity, the likes that most Americans cannot imagine. On the other hand, there's also the fear that GM crop can threaten the environment in fundamental ways and harm human rights. The countries in Africa and some other developing countries are also vulnerable because they are recipients of international aid. And so they tend to be vulnerable to pressure, you know. At the international level, there are discussions right now about a treaty on multinational corporations. It's an ongoing debate within the UN to create a treaty that will be more binding on transnational corporations and might help to hold them more accountable. The second, another possibility are the possibilities of private governance. So when I talk about private governance, I mean things like industry code of conduct or multi-stakeholder initiatives. There are pros and cons to private governance. Some people feel that they lack legitimacy. Some people
Uche, we lost your audio. Can't hear you. Okay, we'll see if we can get Uche back with us. In the meantime, there's a chat space. If anyone has questions they would like to post, and I am going to unmute Carey and Michael so that you can all join in a discussion and hope that we get Uche back. But thank you to everybody for your participation and for, wow, what an amazing conversation. And I think once again, I mean, it's like everybody, I would have loved to hear everybody talk forever. But Carey or Michael, do you have any comments you would like to add?
Is Michael still there? Michael, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just being quiet.
Can you tell us all, and me especially, where everything stands with the appeals with Monsanto on the Johnson case? I know they filed a notice of appeal. Your side filed a notice of cross appeal. And where does that actually go? Which court, and what will be the next shoe to drop, the next thing to happen?
Each side will be, well, we just filed a motion to expedite the briefing procedure to hopefully have the appeal process wrap up sooner so that Mr. Johnson can enjoy the benefits of the outcome, because he's expected not to live beyond the end of 2019. And even then, it's because of that, we're trying to get the appeal process done as fast as possible.
Which court are you in, Michael? No, which court is the appeal in? In the federal court?
California State Court's
Supreme
Court of
Court.
Appeals.
Oh, okay.
No, it's at the Court of Appeals level.
Okay.
Monsanto will have the opportunity to go to the Supreme Court of California if they lose, and I expect they will lose at the appellate level.
Mm-hmm.
When do you expect the appellate court to actually be able to make a ruling? They have to, of course, go through all the evidence and look at transcripts. And are we expecting 6 months from now? 9?
Well, let me just look up. We circulated a schedule that we think will have everything wrap up with the briefing, I think in April of next year.
Okay.
But that's what we're requesting. The court has to agree to it, and Monsanto is opposing that.
Right.
So,
and why the notice of cross appeal? What is the legal significance of the cross appeal?
Judge Bolanos issued an order that basically said you're going to have to do a new trial unless you agree to accept a reduction of the amount of damages that were assigned to you. She said that she thought the punitive damages were too much, and recommended reducing them to $39.2 million, I think it was, and adding that to the compensatory damages for a complete award of $78.5 million. And because we were trying to expedite getting the case resolved, Mr. Johnson agreed to accept that reduction, but Monsanto appealed, and because they appealed, we had the opportunity to say that reduction was not fair. The jury actually did a valid analysis of what the damages are, what it would take to deter a company like Monsanto from future similar conduct. And we'll be saying that the disincentive to engage in similar conduct is better when the damages are higher and at what the jury assessed.
Michael, what was most surprising to you about the jury, if anything, in that case? Was there anything that jumped out?
They were probably the smartest jury you could ever get, and I don't think there were a couple of PhDs, 6 people with post-grad degrees. Every single one of them had a college degree from a fairly high, like UC level type schools. They paid attention throughout very carefully. Nobody was sleeping throughout all the science. You all might have fallen asleep while I was talking.
Not a chance.
And they took copious notes. And throughout the trial, they had the opportunity to write questions to the judge to ask our experts and the witnesses so they could be answered during the trial.
Wow.
They asked extremely detailed scientific questions. One of the women has a PhD in cell biology research, and actually did a lot of mouse studies and doing advanced medication research. She knew how all those studies were done and asked, well, what solvent did you use for that dermal exposure study? Blah, 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 blah. I mean, they were just super detailed questions.
Wow.
One of the funniest ones was partway towards the end of the trial, when we were going through Monsanto's assets for assessing what would deter them. How much would it take to deter them? You can't do a punitive damages award of $100 or even $100,000 to deter a company like Monsanto. You need to have something that is a dent in their value and makes them go, oh, we can't do that. Otherwise, our stock prices will go down, or it'll be bad for us. We have to not do that again. So in the trial, they said they had their net worth was like $6.6 billion, and they had $3 billion of available cash on hand. And one of the jurors, they were all very, very poker faced throughout the trial. We had no idea which way they were leaning on things. And one of the jurors issued a question: didn't Bayer just buy Monsanto for a much larger amount than the $6.6 billion he was referring to? So, shouldn't we be using that for assessing what would it take to deter a company like Monsanto? That was a good one.
That was a good question here.
Afterwards, we found out that the jurors did not think the Monsanto's experts were very credible, and to Brent Wisner's, who was our trial counsel from our firm, credit, he just destroyed their experts. They were poorly prepared and had poor scientific reliance. They did not look at, like if they were an epidemiologist, they didn't look at the animal studies or the mechanistic studies. And the person in charge of the animal studies essentially conceded that he had used the wrong standard for evaluating whether there was an elevated risk beyond the background rate for carcinogenicity. I said, yeah, I guess I made a mistake. So they collapsed, and the jurors noted that and stood up for their verdict, because Judge Bolanos was planning to strike the whole verdict and use an improper standard, which was weighing things in favor. And if there was any question that supported Monsanto's position, the verdict would be invalid. That's the wrong standard. It should be all data and conclusions are weighed in favor of the jurors, the prevailing party, what the jurors found. And unless it's completely irrational to rely upon what the jurors found, you have to leave it alone. And the jurors, when she announced that what she was planning to do, started writing and publishing letters saying, we followed your instructions, we paid attention, we weighed the credibility of the evidence, we weighed the credibility of the experts, and it was we were not behaving as irrationally or impassioned or inflamed. We did exactly what you said. You should leave our verdict alone. And that's unheard of. I don't think, I'm not aware of any other jurors doing things like that. But they were very smart, and listened carefully, and they understood that data. A couple of them pointed to that epidemiology doubling of the risk dose response chart that I mentioned. I said that was the key evidence because it showed dose response under the Bradford Hill criteria for causation. That shows that it's probably a causal connection. They saw the math and paid close attention to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not a jury that could be easily manipulated by one side or the other, which is one thing you sometimes worry about with jury trials because somebody's more flamboyant or flashy or smoother or something like that. So it sounds like you had an amazing jury.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention in response to what Uche mentioned, the lawsuits against activists, that is one of the things they do. They go after people and file suit against them. Carey's company, U.S. Right to Know, her employer, got sued by one of the mouthpieces for the industry and Monsanto. The guild here in California that sponsored the Grange, rather, it used to be the Grange, now it's the Guild, sponsored labeling products that are GMOs, so that you know when you're eating food that has been exposed to glyphosate or Roundup because it's a GMO product. And that effort was attacked, and the industry took over, the national industry, the national Grange, which is a farmer association, ousted the California group, and out of their halls that they'd had for like over 100 years. And in California, they were mostly organic, natural farmers, and they got sued. They lost all of their halls all over California. They sued the individuals who brought the GMO move, and are suing them personally to bankrupt them. Similarly, one of the early scientists that showed that there was carcinogenicity associated with the Roundup formulation, not just glyphosate alone, Dr. Seralini, they organized an attack on him to have him and his science completely invalidated by letters that Monsanto wrote. They circulated to scientists that they thought were sympathetic and had them write into the journal, and had the journal retract and push the journal into retracting Seralini's results. He ended up publishing them later, and his results have been corroborated by others since then.
That's just Machiavellian.
It is Machiavellian, and to Carey's credit, she has stood up to them. And to our credit, we stood up. They tried to have us sanctioned and disbarred and things, all sorts of nasty, taken off the steering committee for publishing the documents that became the Monsanto papers. Carey has done a great job of getting FOIA documents, and combined with the documents we've declassified, it really shows a scary story. And if you want to see some real scary stuff, go into the documents that WikiLeaks has released on the State Department emails and traffic. You'll find some interesting discussions in there about countries being compelled to use GMO products, GMO seeds, or they won't get their IMF funding. That's really creepy.
It is, yeah. So, and that's a really nice segue to what I always ask at the end of these is ultimately, how does this affect what's for lunch and what's on our plates and available food choices? And it sounds to me like what everyone is saying is that, we've got glyphosate in everything, even if we purchase organic. But what do consumers do, and what are some practical steps for people?
Well, and Carey can echo on this, from my perspective, one of the best things to do is to, at the marketplace, choose non-GMO foods. Choose non-GMO organic foods and promote others using those foods because they have less or almost none glyphosate in them, and that's the safest. Then you hit them in the pocketbook. Also, you need to talk to your legislators and your regulators. Let them know that you're concerned and that you want to have safe food, that you've seen some of this science. Go to my website, baumhedlundlaw.com, and look at the Monsanto papers and send those to your Congress people. Go to U.S. Right to Know, the documents that Carey has gotten unsealed through the Freedom of Information Act. Get that information out. Transparency is, our key to protection and safety.
Great resources. Yes. Transparent.
And I would just echo that, Susan. I guess I think as a journalist, truthful, transparent information is the key to being able to make choices for yourself about what you eat and what policies you support, what you feed your children, and whether or not you're motivated to, seek change in public policy, be it at the local level, like, what you want sprayed on your parks and playgrounds, or where you want to shop to buy your groceries, and whether or not you want organic, or you want to look for local farmers that you know and trust, or whether you want to go march in Washington. But you can't make accurate and informed choices without, accurate information. And the evidence shows us that the chemical industry is more interested in protecting their profits than public good, and that regulators too often are putting precedent on the corporate profit side as well over consumer protection. So that's what we're doing at U.S. Right to Know, is just trying to bring the information to light, and so people can make their own decisions.
Great, thank you. Uche, I don't know if you're able to connect with us, if you have any final closing comments or anything. Cannot hear her. That is too bad. Well, thank you everybody for an amazing presentation. And if you want, when I send out notes after this will be uploaded to YouTube, and I'll have it transcribed. But if you want me to, in the follow-up email, to send links to anything, I'm happy to do that as well. So, yeah. Well, thank you to everyone, and it's been a great time spending lunch with you, and just wanted to let you know what's for lunch in January. Now, I might move this to February because I'm also talking with the author of Eating NAFTA, and so I might bump her to January. But January or February, New Year, New Food, will cell cultured meat be on your plate this year? And there again, we have USDA, FDA working on regulation of cell cultured protein, and hoping to have those on your plate next year. One of my questions and concerns is whether safety and environmental aspects of these products are being properly addressed. We don't want to end up with the same problem that we have now with genetically modified foods that were quickly approved under the GRAS process, generally recognized as safe. But so assuming they are approved, what are steps for export in the NAFTA region? And, do we need harmonization of international standards for technology and food? So thank you all so much. Have a lovely holiday season, and we will see you in the new year.